I got a question for you today. I want to start off with a question, and that is just to get you thinking. It is, what is the power of a promise? What power do promises have in your life? And here's a follow-up question. Has anybody ever made you a really, really big promise before? Maybe. So somebody made me a really, really big promise a while back. Her name was Janet Snyder. Made me a big old promise, and I made her a big old promise. In fact, it was 30 years ago this past Monday, we made a big promise to each other. Here's a picture of Promise Day right here. There we are. Don't we look like little children getting married? Yeah. So, and that promise was one where we said to one another, we'll be there for each other through better or worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until we are parted by death. And I wear on this hand a ring that symbolizes that promise. Anybody else got a ring on your hand that symbolizes a promise? Yeah, now kind of look at it for a second. Look at your ring and hold that for a second. It's a promise, sign of a promise. This past summer, I made another promise. I took another vow. I became a part of what's called the Order of the Mustard Seed. And in that order, I took a vow for three things, and one is to be true to Christ through creativity and prayer, and to be kind to all through justice and hospitality, and to share the good news of Jesus with the world through learning and through mission. And so I have on this hand a different ring. It's a sign of that vow. It's a promise, right? It's a promise. Every week, after we gather for worship and we all head out, right before that happens, there's a promise that we remember here. We remember some of the promises that God has made to us, right? Before we walk out, we remember that God has said, I know you, I love you, I know you by name, I love you more than you can imagine or believe, and I will never forsake you. I am with you. Man, those are powerful promises. Here's what I think about promises. I think promises are generative, which means I think that they actually, in the making of a promise, something is created that wasn't there before. I believe that promises offer hope, and I think that promises actually pull us into an unknown future. Promises are something solid or solid-ish that pull us into an unknown future. The power of a promise. Now, Andy Stanley says that Christmas actually begins with a promise. And I love how he phrases this and brought it to my attention. I wanted to bring it to yours. That Christmas begins with a promise, but not the promise you might think. It wasn't a promise to Mary and her fiancé Joseph. It was actually a promise made way before that. Way before that, because the Christmas story doesn't begin with a couple who's trying to figure out how they got pregnant. The Christmas story begins with a couple that's worried that they will never get pregnant. And it doesn't begin with angels announcing in Matthew or Luke. It begins with God making a promise way before that in the book of Genesis, in the very first book of our Bible, way back. And it wasn't just any promise. It was a promise so mind-blowing, so incoherent, so incongruent with the people's lives that it was made to at the time. It was a promise that was impossible, unbelievable, and incoherent, that in their context, they looked at it and said, this possibly can't come true. The promise was made 2,000 years before Jesus was born, about 2,000, give or take. So that means that this promise was made 4,000 years ago. And it's found in the book of Genesis, and it's made to a man by the name of Abram, who later changed his name and called himself Abraham, right? Probably more familiar name. And his wife was named Sarai. She also later changed her name to Sarah. And here's how Christmas began. The Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. Now, we are not sure why God chose Abraham and Sarah, just like we're not really sure why God chose Mary and Joseph. We don't really know why, but God picked them. And God says to Abraham, why don't you leave everything you know? I want you to leave your land, your territory, your people, and I'm gonna point you to a land that you've never been to before. You don't even know anything about it. That's where I want you to go. And this was a very, very dangerous request. Why was it dangerous? Well, because back then, security and safety were all rooted in your tribe, your family, and your geographic location. That is the only source of security for people in that day and in that time. Your family, your tribe, your geographic location. What is God asking Abraham to do? Leave everything that is a source of security. The request is ridiculous that God makes, but the promise is outlandish. So God says to Abraham, this next phrase, this is where the promise begins, Genesis 12:2. I will make you into a great nation. And another part of that promise is God says, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Can you picture that? On a really dark night, going outside, seeing the stars. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Now, the problem with that, according to Abraham's life, is he has no children. How's he going to have descendants? Oh, and by the way, he and his wife are both in their 70s, their mid-70s. And you're going to make my descendants? You're going to make a great nation out of me? Hey, God, I'm sure he's thinking this. Hey, God, why don't you start with making me a great grandfather rather than just a great nation? Let's start with that. The promise goes on. God says, I'll bless you, Abraham, and I will make your name great, which is God's way of saying, Abraham, I'm going to make you famous. And again, putting myself in Abraham's brain, I bet he's thinking something like, God, you're not going to make me famous. You're going to make me forgotten. Because if I am dislocated out of everything that I know, nobody's ever going to remember who I am. They will never know that I even existed. And then the promise goes on. God gets to the completely unbelievable, incoherent, absolutely impossible part of the promise. God says to Abraham, all the families on earth will be blessed through you. In other words, God's saying, Abraham, through you and your descendants, every tribe, every family, every people group. They didn't have nations like we have them today, but every nation, Abraham, is going to be blessed through your life and your descendants. Now, here's the really crazy thing about that promise, is that in that time, in that culture, peoples didn't bless peoples. Tribes didn't bless other tribes. Nations didn't bless other nations. Nations waged war on other nations. Nations conquered other nations. Nations enslaved other nations. Nations plundered other nations. Nations did not bless other nations. Do you see how crazy this is? It made absolutely no sense in that culture. So Abraham says to God, okay, I don't know how this can possibly work out. As you know, God, my wife and I, we don't have any children. Now, I'm going to compress some of the stories that we're going to talk about today, and one of them is Abraham and Sarah's story. You just got to know that they're 75 when this request happens, this promise happens, and miraculously, eventually, they get pregnant. And when they get pregnant, guess how old they are? According to Scripture, 98 and 99. How would you all think about that, you know? Would that be crazy? Yeah. Oh, and by the way, here's how they name him. They name this child that they have Isaac. Isaac is the Hebrew word for laughter. Why did they name their kid Laughter? Because when God told them, oh, by the way, you're going to have a baby when you're 98, 99, according to the Bible, they fell over laughing. So that's how you get a kid named Laughter. Okay, let's put up the family tree because we're going to get lost here in a second in this family tree. And this is the father side of this. Abraham has Isaac. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has, you see next in line here, Jacob. Now, here's the problem with this. There was an older brother, and the older brother is the one that get listed all the time here. There was an older brother named Esau, but Jacob stole Esau's birthright. So I just want you all to know that because these biblical families are more dysfunctional than your family is. Okay, just rest assured. Read the Old Testament and you'll feel great about your children and your parents, all right? Jacob ends up having 12 sons, and here's their story. They're all out one day, and they don't like one of their brothers named Joseph, so they throw him in the well, and 10 of the brothers are kind of ganging up on him. They throw him in a well, and the conversation is this: do we kill him or do we sell him? Do we kill him? Do we sell him? Anybody have little sibling issues in your family? Nothing like this, I'm assuming. They decide, well, if we kill him, we're not going to get any profit out of it, so let's sell him. They sell him as a slave to some Egyptian traders that are coming through. Joseph is taken to Egypt, made a slave there, and as a slave, he rises up in the ranks and actually saves the nation of Israel, according to our scriptures. And then what ends up happening is a famine in the land, and Joseph's family, who don't even know that he's alive, end up immigrating there, reuniting with him, and that's when part of the promise is actually made, fulfilled, that the descendants of Abraham become a nation. Here's the twist. They're a nation of slaves in Egypt for 400 years. It doesn't look like they've been blessed. God, are you blessing us? We're slaves here in this land, this foreign land. We don't like it. We're backbreaking labor. Is this what it looks like to be blessed by you, God? And how are we supposed to be a blessing to other nations? We are slaves here. Somehow through it all, generation after generation, they somehow kept the promise alive. I think that's one of the miracles that we see through this story, is they kept the promise alive in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of disaster. Then God sends a guy by the name of Moses to deliver them. And without telling you the whole story of Moses, when Moses was finished with Egypt and the Pharaoh, nobody in Egypt was feeling very blessed by the descendants of Abraham. It was a big mess. And then this nation of slaves, they make their way across the Red Sea. They make their way into the Promised Land, into the land of Canaan. And the inhabitants, the Canaanites that lived there, did not feel blessed by the descendants of Abraham either. And by the way, let me acknowledge this. I know this doesn't sound very Christmassy, does it? You sticking with me? Will you stick with me through this? Please. Doesn't sound Christmassy, but about 1,000 years have gone by here after God made the promise to Abraham. Abraham became a family, the family became a nation, and the nation becomes a kingdom. And one of the most famous kings in that kingdom is David, King David. And this is where, for the first time, the descendants of Abraham, the kingdom of Israel, they look like they're flourishing. They look like, yes, they are being blessed by God for the first time, and they're able to possibly bless other nations. They don't do a lot of blessing, but they could if they wanted to. David's son is a guy by the name of Solomon, and Solomon also expanded the country of Israel, the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham. And Solomon was, and the wealth of the country was extraordinary. They were at a place where they could bless other nations. But Solomon got sidetracked. He ends up following other gods. And that creates tension and strife in the country, in the nation. The nation is torn apart. It's divided. There's a northern king. This is after Solomon dies. There's a northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and neither of them have the resources, have the talent, have the time, have the anything anymore. They're weak and they're in chaos. What ends up happening not long after that, and by the way, when I say not long, we're talking a 2,000-year span here. So in a couple hundred years, what ends up happening is this empire called Assyria comes in from the north and conquers that whole region. Not only do they conquer the northern kingdom, they conquer the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah. They carry off the leading citizens. They carry off the most trained artisans, and they take them back to Assyria and make them slaves there. Then they import a bunch of Assyrians in to really put the nail in the coffin of Israel. It was during that time when Israel had to recognize, where's the promise? We can't bless ourselves, let alone anybody else. We can't seem to manage anything here. Where's the promise? God reminds them of a promise through a prophet. This happens a number of times through a prophet, this time by the name of Isaiah. And Isaiah, God says this through Isaiah, and God's speaking to the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, saying, I will make you a light to the Gentiles, and you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. In other words, I'm going to do something through you, Israel, that'll radiate light and my presence in a way that will not only reach the descendants of Abraham, but the descendants of everybody, all the non-Jews. That's what the word Gentile means, is all the non-Jews out there. There's the promise. Now, they had to think of themselves when they hear this prophecy, are you kidding me? This is a joke, right? We are not going to be a light. We can't even light up our own lives. And Gentiles, salvation, we can't save ourselves. How are we going to offer salvation to anybody else? After 300 years of chaos go by, and the Assyrian Empire is ruling that area, then the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, and the Babylonians come in, And what do? The same thing as Syrians did. They gather up the top citizens and the artisans that had kind of filled in the positions of those that were taken by Assyria. Babylon takes them away, makes them slaves in Babylon. In the middle of all that, God sends another prophet. This time, it's a prophet by the name of Malachi. And through that prophet, God says, my name will be great among the nations. And the people thought, no way. Your name is being mocked among the nations. Our God can't take care of his own people. There's no way in the world that your name is going to be great among the nations. We can't feed ourselves. We can't protect ourselves. So come on, stop with the empty promises, God. The truth is we're never going to be a blessing to any other nation. The name of God is not going to be made known throughout the nations. Now stick with me here. You still with me? Christmas is coming. Christmas is coming, but not yet. Because after the Babylonians come through, then it's time for the Greeks. You remember a guy from your history lessons called Alexander the Great? Oh yeah. He came through, conquered that area. Then after the Greeks, it was the Romans. They took over in 63 BC, before Christ. And the Roman general, Pompey, a guy by the name of Pompey, they conquer the city of Jerusalem. He rides his horse into the temple area, the holy place. And not only the holy place that is the temple, but he busts open the doors and tears down this curtain that is there to separate the holy of holy places from everything else. That's where they kept one thing. The most holy object in Israel was the Ark of the Covenant. You know, Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant. It was a real thing. It's in there. Pompey is looking for the God of the Israelites. What does he find? A box. And to him and to everybody else, it looked like the God of the Jews was puny and powerless and gone. So I got to ask you, at this point, what is the status of the promise made to Abraham and Sarah 2,000 years before Rome invaded? What's the status? Not good. Not good at all. The descendants of Abraham, yeah, they'd become a nation, but not for very long. They maybe had a little time where they could bless someone else. They didn't really do it, but they had a moment when they could have, and they didn't. They're certainly not a light to the Gentiles. The Jewish God is certainly not going to be worshiped throughout the world. Maybe Jupiter will be, maybe Zeus will be, but not Yahweh, because nobody's interested in a God who can't take care of his own people. But the people somehow kept the promise alive. Think about this. Generation after generation, parents telling their kids, those kids telling their kids about this guy Abraham and this promise that God made, and we've got to stick with it somehow, some way, through the chaos and the destruction and the slavery. There's a promise that transcends all of that. 2,000 years of hoping, 2,000 years of waiting. And that's what makes the story of Christmas so remarkable, because when things were about as hopeless as things could possibly be, when the promise to Abraham was about as far out of reach as it could possibly be, something unexpected happened. The Apostle Paul wrote it this way in Galatians 4:4. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman. When the set time, what was Paul thinking there? What was the set time? Remember what was going on in Paul's set time in the first century, in the Roman Empire. There was something called the Pax Romana. You remember that from your 5th grade history lesson? Pax Romana means the peace of Rome. Rome had conquered that area all around Mediterranean, the known world. You know, it's called the known world. They had conquered that, and they had made a common language accessible to all the nations. They had a highway system that had never been seen before. There was a port system linking all the big population hubs. I mean, think about it. The time had come. God would fulfill that unbelievable, incoherent, impossible promise by utilizing those roads and utilizing those ports and utilizing that common language. That's how Paul saw it. When nobody was expecting it, here's what happened in Luke chapter 1. When nobody was expecting it, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was, what? Mary. And you know what? All over the world, that young woman's name is known. How did that happen? Today, in this month, all over the world, people are going to tell this story all over the world, and they know who Mary is all over the world. How did that happen? Here's what the angel said, Luke 1:30. The angel said to Mary, "Do not be afraid. You found favor with God. You'll conceive and give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus. He will be great. He'll be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord will give him the throne of his father David." David, way back, one of the descendants of Abraham. "And he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever." Jacob, the grandson of Abraham who received the promise. "His kingdom will never end." Well, as it turns out, all the nations of the earth were blessed through Abraham. It just took a while, didn't it? A lot of twists, a lot of turns, a lot of chaos. Israel would, in fact, be a light to the Gentiles, because remember, out of Israel comes Jesus. Jesus was Jewish. The first Christians were Jewish. God sent his son Jesus, and through his life and through his teachings and through his death and through his resurrection, light and life would be taken to the ends of the earth. Every continent, every country. Wow. I like to think of the promise made to Abraham as a thread. Can you picture a thread? And that thread at sometimes was stretched so thin and worn so thin that it looked like it wasn't even there. It looked like God wasn't doing anything, It wasn't always evident. People lost sight of it. But during that entire period of time, God was behind the scenes working, getting the world ready for the incarnation. Incarnation, fancy word for God becoming human. Through Christmas, we're reminded in the most remarkable way imaginable that God is active even when it seems like God is not there. Right? That's the history, 4,000-year history, that God is active, even when sometimes it seems like God is not even there. That God, even when God is silent, God is not still. It's a reminder that even when the circumstances seem like God doesn't care, that God hears and God is at work. And we're reminded that God keeps promises. So what promises has God made to you? God has said, "I'll never leave you, never forsake you. I will guide you. I'll bring light into your darkest night." God has said and promised you, death doesn't win ever. Even when it looks like it has, life wins every time. And those are the big promises. God's made you little promises too. What are those? Have you forgotten some of them because it's been a while? The promises are real. God is real. So to answer the question that this series is named after, who needs Christmas? Well, the answer is the world needs Christmas. The world needs hope. The world needs the light of the world. And it turns out that it isn't just the world that needs Christmas, but God needs Christmas. And that's where we're going to pick up next week. And for today, that's the good news. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.